Hello and welcome to the English Story Nook. We are so happy you have chosen to join us today. Let's get started with another wonderful story to help you improve your English. Today, we're diving into a story about a woman who makes a brave and sudden decision to change her entire life. You will learn about the courage it takes to start over and the quiet strength found in moments of uncertainty. It is a story about the journey toward finding your own voice and your own path. Before we dive in, if you enjoy our stories and want to support what we do, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and consider buying us a coffee on Ko-fi. There's a link in the description below. Every like, subscription, and small contribution helps us keep creating great content for English learners like you. And now to the story. The taxi driver didn't ask why. The vinyl seat of the taxi was cool against JL's skin, a stark impersonal contrast to the life she had just jettisoned. Outside, the city lights smeared into long neon ribbons as the car pulled away from the curb. The driver, a man with a weathered face and quiet hands, hadn't asked a single question when she'd bundled her single, overstuffed duffel bag into his trunk. He hadn't asked about the unshed tears glistening in her eyes, or the tremor in her hand as she'd given him a vague destination on the other side of town. He just drove. His silence was a balm, a welcome void in a life that had become saturated with noise, most of it curated by Samiran. It had culminated an hour ago in an argument that felt both climactic and utterly banal. Samiran, ever the architect of their shared existence, had presented her with a new wellness schedule, optimized by the proprietary algorithms from his firm, Silmarillion Analytics. It detailed her sleep cycles, her social interactions, even her spontaneous creative time. When she'd pushed back, her voice tight with a frustration she could no longer swallow, he had deployed his usual gentle brand of psychological warfare. "Jay, darling," he'd said, his tone dripping with condescending patience, "your emotional response is clouding your logic. The data doesn't lie." It was his signature move, a subtle form of gaslighting that left her questioning her own sanity. He was so adept at it, his manipulations so polished, that arguing felt like trying to catch smoke. That was the moment the intricate, beautiful cage he had built around her finally became visible. Their life was an amalgam of his preferences, his ambitions, and his data points, all masquerading as a shared dream. He wasn't a partner, he was a curator, and she was his prize exhibit in the gallery of their curated life. The realization was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping dread that had finally solidified into resolve. While he was on a call, fine-tuning some other unfortunate soul's existence, she had packed one bag, a decade of her life condensed into a handful of clothes, 2 books, and a laptop scrubbed of his influence. It was an act of rebellion, small and silent but seismic in its significance. Now, in the anonymous cocoon of the taxi, her phone began to buzz. A relentless, frantic vibration against her leg. Samiran! A cascade of notifications lit up the screen. Texts, missed calls, calendar alerts for their reconciliation dinner he'd no doubt already scheduled. The ubiquitous presence of his control, embedded in the very technology meant to connect them, felt like a digital chain. Each buzz was a tug, an attempt to pull her back. She stared at the glowing screen, at his handsome, smiling face on the wallpaper. A photo taken on a trip he'd planned because an algorithm suggested it would yield a 92% optimal memory rating. The whole relationship felt like a grand act of subterfuge where genuine emotion was replaced by calculated performance. With a decisive movement, JL held down the power button. The screen went black. The vibrations ceased. The silence in the cab deepened, becoming something she could inhabit rather than endure. In that quiet, she began to untangle the threads of his influence. It had been so insidious, the way he'd eroded her confidence. He would constantly move the goalposts for what defined their happiness. First, it was a shared fitness app to sync their health. Then it was a budget tracker that analyzed every purchase. Each new layer of technology was presented as a panacea for modern life's complexities, but in reality, it was a tool for his surveillance. The dichotomy between his proclaimed intentions, her happiness and well-being, and the suffocating reality of his control was staggering. She remembered a trip to visit her family, which he had subtly sabotaged. He hadn't forbidden her from going, but he'd presented data on the emotional and financial inefficiency of the visit, framing his argument as a logical conclusion rather than a personal desire. It was another masterful piece of subterfuge designed to isolate her. His influence was pernicious, a slow-acting poison that had convinced her his voice was her own inner wisdom. The constant low-level disquiet she'd felt for years finally had a name: oppression. The taxi slowed, caught in a snarl of late-night traffic. The sudden stillness was jarring. Red taillights bled into the rain-slicked street, and for a terrifying moment, the silence she had craved felt like a void. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through her resolve. Was she being irrational? Was he right? The effectiveness of his long-term gaslighting was that its echoes lingered. A phantom voice of self-recrimination, she caught her reflection in the window, a pale, uncertain face superimposed over the gridlocked city. The woman staring back was an amalgam of who she had been and who she was fighting to become. The feeling of being so utterly alone was incongruous with the densely packed city around her. A profound sense of disquiet settled in her stomach. Just as the knot of panic tightened in her chest, the taxi's central console flickered to life. An incoming call routed through the cab company's dispatch. The driver glanced at the screen, then at her in the rearview mirror. His eyes were neutral, but she saw a flicker of understanding. It was Samiran. Of course it was. He wouldn't just use her phone. He would find another way in. He would always find another way. This was the crisis point, the moment where her silent rebellion required a voice. "Don't answer it," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "Please, just keep driving." The driver held her gaze for a second longer, then gave a single, decisive nod. He pressed a button on the console, and the call was dismissed. He expertly navigated the car out of the traffic jam, turning down a side street she didn't recognize. The action was simple, but it was a monumental victory. She had drawn a boundary, and a stranger had helped her defend it. She realized then that the perfect, curated life he offered was built on a foundation of control, its promises of happiness entirely ephemeral. His pernicious need to manage every variable had been the very thing that poisoned it all. When they finally pulled up to a small, unassuming hotel, the rain had softened to a drizzle. The driver got out and retrieved her bag from the trunk, placing it gently on the wet pavement. He still didn't ask why. His quiet respect was the greatest kindness she had received in years. As she paid, her hands no longer shaking, she looked at him. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying a weight far beyond the fare. He simply nodded again and drove away, disappearing into the city's glow. Standing on the pavement, with her one bag and the infinite, terrifying possibility of an unwritten future, Jael felt a profound sense of peace. The dichotomy between the gilded cage she'd left and this anonymous freedom was absolute. The future felt ephemeral, a fleeting and uncertain thing, but it was hers. The incongruous sight of the luxury duffel bag outside the budget hotel made her smile. She had escaped the ubiquitous digital surveillance and the insidious chipping away of her soul. She understood now that there is no app, no algorithm, no technological panacea for a life that is fundamentally misaligned. He could no longer move the goalposts because she had left the game entirely. The quiet hum of the city was the only sound, and for the first time in a long time, it was more than enough. That's the end of our story for today. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the quietest decisions are the most life-changing. Have you ever had a moment in your life that felt like a fresh start? We would love to hear about it in the comments. Sharing your story is a great way to practice your English, and remember to check the description box for some extra learning materials for this story. Thank you for joining us at the English Story Nook. Keep practicing, stay curious, and we look forward to seeing you in our next story. Happy learning!